That's the important thing about human beings. They remember a time before they were born. So, if you remember a time before you were born, what is your memory of that? Well, your memory is best served by seeing yourself through the passage of time, through people that you are part of that lineage. So that's why the genealogy is important.
My journey is to find out where my grandfather and great-grandfather came from, who they were, where they lived, pretty much how they live. It's important because first off, it's not only for my children, but I think it's for me, who I am, and my makeup. Why do I talk so loud? Why am I goofy or something like that? Yeah. But it's just who I am. Okay.
British historian Geoffrey Elton said, "What we call history is a mess we call life, reduced to some order, pattern, and possibly purpose." Perhaps this challenge is what drew me to genealogy, the messiness. It's so human. Many times I feel like a detective searching for a clue that will blow the case wide open. And then when I find it, it's not at all what I expected. Messy.
In 2011, two strangers agreed to work together, searching for evidence of a man born 170 years before. This search would cover thousands of pages of historical documents and span the Pacific from Guam to the Hawaiian Islands of Oahu and Kauai. This search would take the two across the water in time.
When Yolanda contacted me and asked if I could help her determine if her great-grandfather was from Guam, I was immediately interested. I was happy to help someone make a connection to Guam. For me, trying to make a connection when only a hint of one exists is exciting. Yolanda had been working on her genealogy since 1976, but she was not able to confirm where her great-grandfather was from. While they had been told that they were part Guamanian, they knew very little about his life.
Because the census was kind of confusing. Guam, yes. Spain, Guam, Spain. So it's like, okay, are we from Spain, or and then Guam, and so the documents there was confusing. So I wasn't sure where to go.
The earliest and latest documents indicated John was born in Guam, but the 1900 and 1910 census recorded Spain as his birthplace. Was this the same person? After scrutinizing the records, it became clear that even though the spelling of the surname was different in many of the documents, and the birthplace was listed as either Guam or Spain, that this was our John Paris. We knew this because of the household members enumerated along with John, his wife and children. The ages of the household members and the location of the residence all confirmed that this was our John Paris. Since Guam was a colony of the Kingdom of Spain when John was born, technically, both Guam and Spain were correctly recorded as his birthplace. Having determined the various spellings of John's name and the conflict with his birthplace, we were able to reveal a portion of his life in Hawaii. John arrived in Hawaii sometime before 1870 when he became a naturalized citizen of the Kingdom of Hawaii. On this document, he signed his name, Juan Paris. We find him next in marriage records when he married Pauelua, a full-blooded Hawaiian, in 1877. They married in the Kawaiaha church in Honolulu, the first Christian church on the island. We don't find him again until 1890. By this time, he has moved to Lihu, Kauai, and has 4 children. Henry, born about 1875, Paulina, born about 1880, Sowella, possibly Isabella, born about 1885, and Thomas, born about 1889. John is listed as Luna on a sugar plantation in the 1890 census and the 1890 and 1892 Honolulu City Directory. In 1892, he was working for the Grove Farm Plantation in Lihu. It is probable that he worked continuously as a Luna for the period between these years. A Luna was a plantation overseer. Lunas had a reputation of being hard taskmasters. According to the UH website History of Labor in Hawaii, fierce overseers known as Luna rode on horses carrying whips which they were not hesitant to use on workers. This description fit family stories that Yolanda had heard about her grandfather. He was known to be stern, had horses, and knew how to make saddles and bullwhips. By 1910, John, now 58 years old, has moved his family to Kaloa, Kauai. He and his wife, now recorded as Ki'anui, has added one child to the family, a son named John Paris, born about 1892. Henry and Sewella are no longer recorded with the family. It was learned later that Henry died in 1910. No record of Sewella has been found, but she is also believed to have died. John Sr. is no longer employed as a Luna, but cultivates a taro patch in Kaloa. 10 years later, in 1920, he and Ki'anui are recorded in the same location. He is listed as a harness maker and owns a harness saddle shop. Grandson, Henry Jr., now lives with them. The last document that we have is John's death certificate. He died May 10, 1928, in Honolulu. He was buried in the cemetery of the Kawaiaha Church. This was the same church where he married 51 years earlier. It became the final resting place of both John and Ki'anui, a couple that had carved out a life together on the Garden Isle of Kauai. Feeling confident that the information we had so far was valid, Yolanda continued the research on her side of the ocean, and I began my search in Guam records. I had many questions. Why did John leave Guam? When did he leave, and by what means? I delved into the Guam records. It was hard to believe, but after an exhaustive search, not a single document was found for a John or one Paris between the years 1840 and 1877. Frustrated, I contacted Yolanda in California. It was then that she told me that John was known to have changed his name from Demetrio to John. Although we had no documentation of this name other than oral history, I renewed my search. I visited the Spanish documents collection at the Micronesian Area Research Center.
We went to the boxes at the archives, and we found the original documents where indicate that Demetrio Perez used to own a house here in Agaña, but he sold this house to Jose Blas y Asunción in the year 1868. The property was acquired by purchase from Don Demetrio Perez in the year 1868. Okay, and it was sold for $50 pesos in those days. Okay, so after 1868, is not more evidence of the name of Demetrio Perez here in Guam. Then the question is, so he left or he died? But saying there's no other document. Now, we don't have manifestos of him living, because it also was a practice that many people went into the whaler ships and as a stowaway, as we had an account in this document. Okay. Yeah, so it's impossible to pinpoint which document say that he left the island. So he can just embark in one of the whaling ships. Also, it was a practice that when the captain discovered there were stowaways in the ship, he doesn't have any obligation to return them back to Guam. Oh. Okay, so they were free to establish themselves someplace else.
A search of ships that left Guam and arrived in Hawaii from 1854 to 1872 yielded 73 ships with hundreds of voyages. Finding the one ship that Juan Demetrio left on would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Running out of leads on Guam, Yolanda and I decided to meet in Hawaii to continue our research. I hope to find additional information that would reveal when and how John had arrived in Hawaii. After a flight from Guam last night, and got on the plane and came to Kauai, and finally met Yolanda after 2 years of communicating with her, never meeting her. And that was exciting. Very nice to finally meet her family. Our first stop was the Kauai Historical Society.
We looked for John Paris, which we found by going under the P's. And we found him right here on page 331 under P-E-R-R-I-S. So we gave it 331 and we pull up a record. A lot of these records are spotty. This record is only for a year or two. And when you go through these journals, a lot of times, if you can find the housing records, you'll find another John Paris.
Oh, okay.
But this one does not have it. But we do have here is that this is his payroll. We found him under Paris.
Yes.
P-E-R-R.
P-E-R-R-I-S.
And there's an index here, and we see
Yes,
that he
Paris.
is right there on
Yes.
page 331.
That would be good.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, the name was spelled many ways. Many ways.
And here is his record.
Oh,
right
there's
there.
his right, 1885. So this was 5 years before the 1890 census. Our next stop was the Grove Farm Plantation in Lihu, where John worked as a Luna from 1890 to 1892. The curator, Moises, was able to share with us some really great video of the plantation workers, as well as more ledgers from this plantation that shows that John Paris, as well as his son, Henry, worked here in the early 1890s. So that's really great information.
Henry got paid $1, and then on the next year he was paid $2. It's like, whoa! But great-grandpa John got paid $20, and back then they told me it was big money. $20 was big money back then. $20 lasted for 2 years. So to me, Luna, rich, yeah, it's pretty cool.
The following day, we visited the Kauai Family History Center, where we hoped to learn more about people listed along with John Paris in the 1890 census. Of particular interest were Thomas and Victoria Pamies, possibly Payne, and Maria I. Guerrero. Thomas was born in Guam, and Maria was a widow with children that were part Hawaiian. If I could establish a connection between them, then it might help to identify the Guam family of John Paris. Keola Washington, an expert in Hawaiian genealogy, explains.
Thomas Haynes, Thomas Perez, and Guerrero, their wives are all sisters.
Yeah, that's what I
Oh, okay.
I came to that conclusion.
So Thomas,
Yeah.
Their wives
yes.
are sisters. In Lihue, they all live by each other. Their wives are all sisters. So this land all belongs to Ikeole. A birth, death, marriage certificate starts from 1909 to the present, and there's just a few before 1909. But land and title has a lot of genealogy. It has way more genealogy than state documents. Yeah, land gives way back. Yeah, sometimes a lot of names and relatives.
Because a lot of times it recounts the history of the land, right?
Yeah, and land was before document.
It was also revealed to us that Kia Nui, John's wife, was granted a land patent in 1914 for land under the Kuleana Homestead Act. Only Hawaiians were eligible for Kuleana land. The Great Mehele allowed for ownership of land by commoners as early as 1848, but many did not understand the need to make a claim for land that they already lived on and worked. This was probably the case for John and Ki'anui, who were living on Kuleana land as early as 1900, but did not make a claim until 1914. Following the land records, we learned that in 1920, John signed a planting agreement with a Mr. Nakamura, allowing the Japanese man to plant on the Paris family land. It is probable that John, 78 years old at the time, was no longer able to work the land. Sometime after 1920 and before his death in 1928, John and Ki'anui moved to Honolulu to live with their daughter, Paulina. Our last day in Kauai, we visited the homestead lands in Koloa. This was an emotional visit for the descendants of John Paris.
This is Lawai, famous Lawai. How we found this place was through the census. The 1900 census, 1910, 1920, describes the address and who lived in this area, which was John and Kiainiu, and then their children, Henry, Thomas, Pauline, and John. And then this is how we found the place, because they grew up here.
And when the man said Kua Road, I'm like, it sounds so familiar. So when I said, I know where Kua is, it's by that intersection. We were right on the road. And look, we found it. Like, we are standing on the ground right now. It's so amazing. I'm totally, like, it is overwhelming. I mean, all this research, I can only imagine. Yeah, and then when she said she was coming, I didn't know it was this intense. Like, you know, I didn't know the depths of this whole investigation. Now it all makes sense. We still got a lot of research to see where we actually came from, where our grandparents came from, but we have accomplished, I think these two ladies have accomplished like a great deal. I mean, I never expected it to lead up to this point as far as finding land, you know. I know land wasn't of our concern. All we wanted to know is the grounds our ancestors stepped on. We were standing on it. And it's amazing to know that.
Like today, just finding out where my Tutu man, where he lived, but then also learning different names, and then meeting Gillette and Krina, you know, finding out that we have history in Guam, which I think is awesome because I have tons of friends from Guam. So yeah, everything is just, it's overwhelming and exciting all at the same time.
Going through this whole emotional experience with the whole family is a neat experience. I actually got goosebumps at many different occasions when something would pop up and it would be an answer to something or something else to look into. Just being here, I think this was the one that I was the most excited at, and the girls can tell you in the van that this is what I wanted to see was their property. And I think the sense of place when you're here and you feel it and you knew that your great-great-great-grandfather touched these grounds and worked these grounds, there is a definite emotional connection to it.
Because we were not able to find a definitive connection between the Hawaii Paris family and a family in Guam, we turned to genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy is often used when genealogists hit a brick wall in their research. It is used in conjunction with traditional genealogy and history. There are 3 types of tests. Y-DNA testing can confirm genealogical connections on the direct paternal line. Generation after generation, Y-DNA is passed on by direct paternal ancestors. Only males carry Y-DNA. Mitochondria DNA testing uncovers deep ancestral origins of the direct maternal line. So your mother, mother's mother, mother's grandmother, etc. Women pass their mitochondria DNA on to children of both sexes, but only female children pass it on to their children. Like Y-DNA, mitochondria DNA is passed on generation after generation. Autosomal DNA is inherited from both parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, etc. It offers the greatest opportunity to discover genetic cousins. Testing can connect you with relatives descended from any of your ancestral lines, including the most recent 5 to 6 generations. Yolanda and Benjamin, her brother, had their DNA tested to see if they could establish a link to a family in Guam. Both tested their autosomal DNA, and Benjamin tested his Y-DNA. This was a long shot, as I was not certain how many people on Guam had their DNA tested. My father, Justo Tori Leon-Guerrero, tested years ago when I first became interested in DNA testing. His second cousin, Jose Perez, also agreed to be tested. Founder of DNAexplained.com, Roberta S., explains.
So what we did was we tested those 4 people, and your father actually matched everyone. And we of course expected Yolanda and Benjamin to match because they're siblings. They share half of their DNA between them. But we didn't know how everybody else would match. And as it turns out, Benjamin and Yolanda did not match Jose directly, but your father matched all three of them. And the reason is that as you look down the tree from their common ancestor, Jose Perez in Guam is more distantly removed from Yolanda and Benjamin than your father is. He's a generation more upstream as you look at the estimates from family tree DNA in terms of how related these people are to each other. So that's a really good thing because it allowed us to compare the DNA of all of these people to your father. So when we did that, we were able to determine, as on the chromosome chart that you have in front of you, we were able to determine that there were several segments of your father's DNA that actually matched at least two of those people, and at least one segment that all three of those people matched on the same segment to your father. And this confirms that they did indeed have a common ancestor, and they're all sharing that piece of that common ancestor's DNA even yet today.
When the results arrived, we were shocked. They revealed that Dad and I were related to the descendants of John Paris in Hawaii. Imagine the chances of that. Two strangers meeting online and finding out that they are related. This was a breakthrough that we needed. Not only did we have a genetic link between the Paris family in Hawaii and a family on Guam, but we had new avenues to investigate in locating the Guam roots of John Paris.
But when you take the known genealogy and then the unknown generations beyond that, and the estimates on the autosomal, and the fact that there was one mutation on the Y line, which indicates some distance, but not a great distance, we're looking at about the fourth or fifth generation. And sure enough, when we look at the genealogy and the history that you put together, that dovetails right in there. Based on the Y line DNA results, that they have a common ancestor with the two families do back in Guam. And we confirmed roughly how closely they're related based on the autosomal results. So we can put those two pieces together, the Y line confirming it is the same paternal ancestor, and the autosomal results estimating at the second and third cousin level, and your research, and that gives you tools to continue looking down the path to find that missing link, that one common ancestor. You're within a generation, you're very close.
While this news was encouraging, we still didn't know when or how Juan, also known as Demetrio, left Guam. Looking at the historical record, Carlos Madrid explains what life might have been like for him.
Thinking that Demetrio Perez was born in around the 1840s, early 1840s, he probably grew up by the time he had consciousness about his life in the 50s, 1850s. That was a period of good governance under the term of military engineer Felipe de la Corte, who was one of the very best governors that Guam had during the Spanish administration. He stayed here 11 years. However, those were difficult. That was a difficult decade that was covered by natural disasters, epidemics, and very, very hard times at the same time. Thinking that he was born in Agaña, chances are that he was more educated than the rest of the people of the Marianas. There were more facilities for education in Agaña with the Colegio de San Juan de Letrán, the school for girls, the school for boys. Well, certainly there were some episodes that were taking place in Guam that he must have known for sure. 1855, there was a super typhoon that destroyed many parts of Guam, and it has a huge impact on the living conditions of the people at the time. And 1 year later, 1856, there was a smallpox epidemic that wiped out around 50% of the people of Guam. I think it's hard for us to imagine now the level of destruction that and sorrow that event played during those days. The only thing that we can compare is either World War II in the 1940s or the time of the conquest in the late 17th century. But it was a landmark for the people of Guam that lasted for decades and decades. For sure, Demetrio Perez must have known about that and have experienced that. Pago was, half of the people of Pago died, and the remaining inhabitants have to move away. So it was a time of change, it was a time of problems. He was probably around 11, 12, old enough to realize, to see relatives dying, to go through the disease himself. For one way or another, it might have affected him to live when he did. He left in the 1860s, right?
Yes.
And economically, those were times of change in Guam. The whaling trade is no longer what it used to be, and yet the Suez Channel has not been opened. So Guam is as far as Europe as it had never been. So there was no instances for economic advancement, not as many as there used to be before. When with the whaling trades, there were like, what, 30 to 40 ships per year in Guam. And as the decades evolved, there were less and less and less. So there were times of change, and at the same time, the colonial government didn't want the adult, healthy males to leave Guam, because they were the agents for development that they wanted to be here in Guam, to promote harvesting, trade, internal commerce. And if all of them migrate, Guam will be left behind. To that extent that we don't really know if Demetrio migrated legally or illegally, and both possibilities are plausible. If we think that he may have migrated illegally, we will have an explanation why he changed his name upon arrival to Hawaii, from Demetrio to Juan.
One plausible theory is that Demetrio left Guam on a whaling ship. While researching in Hawaii, I found over 20 men from Guam who had become citizens of the Hawaiian Kingdom between the years 1844 and 1870. While it does not state how these men left, the possibilities for travel was limited. Anthony Ramirez is a descendant of Joaquin Sablon, who was a contemporary of John Perez. He became a naturalized Hawaiian citizen a few months after Juan Perez in 1870.
My great-great-grandfather's brother, Joaquin, went on a whaling ship at the age of 14. The farm belt of Guam, for some families, was the Halagua, Tuzan area, Mongmong area, where people had farms. So every day, young kids would go to these areas to tend to the farm. So the day he went to go to the farm, he didn't go. He went aboard the Daniel Webster, and that was the last they heard of him. And at the age of 14, he was recruited by the whaling ship. But this was not uncommon at the time. Chamorros have been moving out of the Marianas even during the Spanish period.
While Joaquin Sablon never returned to Guam, Jose Mendiola Taitano did.
My ancestor was Jose Mendiola Taitano. He was born in 1840. He was referred to as Tatangkatan. He left when he was 15, so sometimes I guess these young men were enticed or, recruited forcefully. You would think that most of those people who left probably did so to escape or, out of a sense of adventure, maybe. So this leads me to believe that he was probably shanghaied. So he tried to come back. See, so but that's entirely speculative.
Joaquin Sablon and Jose Mendiola Taitano both left Guam on whaling ships at an early age. If Demetrio is the same Demetrio Perez that sold land to Jose Blas Asuncion in 1868, he would have been 26 years old. What impact did this have on his mode of transport? Did he have the means to pay for passage on a merchant ship? Or did he join the crew of a whaling ship? Did he stow away? We may never know.
What we do know is that he arrived in Hawaii before 1870. He married a full-blooded Hawaiian and raised a family on the island of Kauai. For whatever reason, he did not leave any clues about his family on Guam. Perhaps he had no immediate family left due to the tragic events in Guam at the time. We do know that he had extended family in Guam from DNA evidence connecting his descendants to Guam. While we did not find answers to all of our questions, we were successful in establishing the Guam origins of John Perez. But more than that, two strangers took a journey across the water and back in time, and came out on the other end not only friends, but family.
And it's true, my great-grandfather, that I'm related to Gillette, because he's from Guam, and that's pretty cool. Yeah, yeah, that is. And then what's also interesting is the fact that the names keep popping up, Benito and Thomas Paine and Guerrero, and so you know that they were from Guam, and so that's the connection, you know, that they were from Guam, and so we can start going back.
Yes.
And find the connection there. And it's also interesting is that all these Guam, I think they might be either brothers or cousins, and then they marry 3 sisters.
Sisters, yes, yes.
So that's another investigation we gotta do.
Honestly, at first I wasn't interested in her doing it because I just thought, you know, it's kind of boring, and you know, I already know who my family is. Well, her family, her brothers and sisters and my cousins. But once she kept telling the stories, it was like, wow, you know, some of them were funny, some of them were sad, and some of them just like left it open where you're just like, oh, I wonder what happened next. But being here these past couple of days has changed everything. Like, I'm very proud of my mom, and I'm proud of what she's done. And it's kind of nice to put places, names all together of the stories that I heard.
You know, the hardest part for me was out there working, and really I didn't know what nationality I was. Outside of my mom was pure Samoan, so I knew that part, but my dad's part I didn't know. And for my dark skin with the name Paris, I had a hard time cashing my check. Hey, what nationality are you? I don't know, French, I guess, Paris, right?
I mean, I'm happy because I met you, and I met, you know, all my family, and I'm happy that we're going through that DNA. I'm happy that I get family in Guam. It's because one day I might be up there, on vacation.
When you're talking about genealogy, books are excellent to read and resources to read, but really it's the human elements that connect us. Not documentations. Okay, where's your birth record? Where's all of this, you know? I mean, those are fine because they provide the information.
For me, the journey is not just, you know, for sure it's the research and all of that, but it's also the human connections that I have, that I've made, and, you know, getting to know Yolanda, you know, who was a complete stranger, and now we're, you know, best buddies, and her daughter, and her family. It's just, you know, I feel like now I have family here in Hawaii.